And we're on. Good day, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Bill Davis, and this is October 22nd of 1998, and I am the current chief engineer of KROC Radio in Rochester, Minnesota. Sitting next to me is Mr. Fred Clarke, who was the very first engineer at KROC. And I mentioned to Steve Raymer that I had been in contact with Fred, and Fred has been very helpful to me in a couple of respects recently here. And so Steve decided it would be a good idea for us to make a little tape of things. And seeing as we have no idea of where we're going, I have no more to say in introduction, but other than to say hello, Fred, and thanks for coming down today.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's been a pleasure to meet you and work with you a little bit and talk about old times. So that's right down my alley.
Yeah, no, you know, my first date that I have that's useful for me is end of 35 when you put KROC on the air. But in those days, there were fewer than 600 radio stations in the country, a lot of them coming on in the 20s and 30s. But it was kind of a unique thing to go into in those days. So what kind of schooling did you have? What motivation did you have to go into this field? And what did you go to do for school in those days?
Well, to begin with, I guess I cut my teeth on radio at the age of about 10.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, built crystal sets. I was mentioning earlier that the first dollar I ever made in radio was building a crystal set for a neighbor at the age of about 11, I think. So that was the real beginning. And then on through high school, of course, I dabbled with ham radio. And on leaving high school, my plan was to, if possible, find a radio job of some type that would allow me to go to school either part during the day or evening. My first job after high school was with KSTP for a short time. Now, I had a background in dabbling with radio, but I needed some more training to get my license. So I made a contract with an engineer at KSTP, transmitter engineer, to come out there and have him give me personal tutoring.
Really?
Which he did. So he tutored me up to the point of getting my license. In those days, a license required code. You had to send and receive code 20 words a minute.
Okay.
So he also coached me in code. I finally got my license, and at that time, KSTP was building a composite transmitter. They were going up in power. I think they were about 10 kilowatts then, and they wanted to get up to 25 and 50 kilowatts. So they were building this composite transmitter, and I had a job helping build it. Well, after that was completed, there was no more work. So I got a job with Northwest Airlines as a radio operator at the end of their line, which at that time was Pembina, North Dakota. Pembina is up on the Canadian border and was the port of entry at that time for traffic coming down from Winnipeg.
So Northwest had a field there then?
Well, a field, but Northwest built a lovely hangar and adjacent living facilities for the staff. We had lovely rooms and a cook and all the comforts of home there. So I worked up there for about 8 months and was promoted to chief engineer of their key station in St. Paul. So moved back to St. Paul.
And this was, I mean, all of the communications with airplanes then was in Morse code?
No, it was a voice.
It was, okay.
Yeah, right. These weren't traffic control towers as such. They were en route communication.
Okay.
We'd contact the planes every 20 minutes en route, and the other ground stations.
Okay.
However, my interest had always been in broadcast. I'm a great music lover, had a great interest in broadcasting, and became quite friendly with one Lester Carr, remember that name. We'll meet him again in chapters 12, 13, 14. Les Carr was assistant chief engineer at KSTP and a very brilliant guy. One day I called him on some other matter. I don't know what it was. But he said, incidentally, we just got a CP for our Rochester station. Well, very interesting. As you know, I want to get into broadcasting. Got a job for me there? He said, well, why don't you come down and talk to Lynn Smebby? Lynn Smebby was the chief engineer of KSTP at that time. So I went down and talked to Lynn. He says, well, fine. However, the engineers there are going to have to announce as well as be engineers. So he said, you think you can announce?
You have a wonderful voice, Fred. I mean.
Well, I'd been talking on the air, of course, at Northwest, but that isn't the same as radio announcing.
Okay.
So what I did again, hired one of the KSTP announcers to give me tutelage in announcing. So that went on for a few months, and finally Ken Hance, the manager of KSTP, called me in. He said, I'd like to have you give me an audition as an announcer, which I did. And apparently he was satisfied, so he hired me. Well, it was going to be a while before they were going to be in the building process at Rochester, so they put me at work at KSTP as a control room operator. And then finally day came to move to Rochester and start actual building, which was on September 1st of 1935. Took us a month to build a station. Went on the air the evening of the last day of September. And we went on from there.
One thing that you commented to me regarding equipment was that in those days, and apparently at KSTP, they were building the transmitter
Building the
from
transmitter.
components. What was the availability of components in those days?
Components were, by and large, easy to come by. In some cases, you had to construct your own. For instance, on this transmitter, we made fixed variable capacitors.
Made them.
A huge thing that stood 6, 7 feet high with plates and so on. Other things, fixed capacitors in the lower voltage areas, were readily available. And of course the tubes were the large water-cooled tubes.
Water-cooled. Now, the transmitter the KROC used, first of all, was an RCA, and this was a new thing to have a pre-built transmitter.
Yes, almost no transmitters at that time were factory built. You built your own. The KSTP transmitter, or the KROC transmitter, was quite a revelation to anybody that had ever seen a broadcast transmitter at that time. Typically, they were very large black panels. I think the KSTP transmitter we built was probably 30 to 40 feet long and 7 or 8 feet high. Well, this little RCA transmitter we bought for KROC arrived at the KSTP studios, and we put it in the studio to keep it there for a while. And the announcers looked at it and they would say, how many ice cubes does that make?
Yeah, I mean, it was comparatively small.
Yeah, very small.
Man.
It was even smaller than you see it today, because later, of course, we increased the size to 250 watts.
Right, because the original KROC transmitter was 100 watts.
100 watts, right.
And then increased to 250.
That's right. The original power amplifier on the 100-watt version was 4 to 11 tubes. And these were Class B, the modulator. And the modulated stage was down below, feeding these 4 output tubes as Class B. When we went to 150 watts, we changed the Class B amplifier to Class C and put a modulator up on top to modulate that stage.
I see. Well, it's really the equipment. One thing that's happened in recent years is equipment has gotten so reliable. If you were a transmitting operating engineer in the 30s when you got started, what was your daily routine? How many things did you need to check and readjust each day, or was it really not that complex?
Not that complex, really. You had a lot more meter reading to do. That was before remote control. So the transmitter operator every half hour had to read the meters and log them and keep an eye on the frequency. Oscillators weren't as stable in those days, so you had to keep an eye on the frequency and bring it back if it got off very far. Otherwise, there wasn't a lot of checking to do.
Well, every half hour. Now I think we've got to do it once a day.
Once a day.
Once a day, and even then it gets pretty boring because the numbers don't change a great deal. The FCC since then, has almost come and gone. I mean, right now, broadcasting is something which they don't even spend a great deal of time with. At one point, it was all that they did, and the FCC was very involved and had a great deal of regulation in those days. In the 30s, you mentioned a construction permit, which is a standard thing still required today. But you also mentioned that the KSTP was trying to just physically, develop as much power as they could. What were the power authorizations like in those days? I mean, once you had a signal, you were able to just pump as much into the air as you could get.
No, it's very much like today. You simply applied for the power increase.
Okay.
It wasn't long, though, after that a power increase meant a directional antenna.
Right.
So the problem then was to get as much power as you could with a non-directional antenna, which meant that you had to do a lot of field intensity measurements and prove that you weren't going to interfere with anybody. Otherwise, it was pretty much like it is today.
Okay. Well, I guess things don't really change all that much.
The FCC, though, kept a close eye on you in those days. The inspector would make frequent and unannounced calls. And your meter log and every other log ought to be up to date.
Or you were in big trouble.
That's right. Incidentally, in the very beginning of KROC, the requirement was to announce every record you played as a recorded performance.
Right.
Every 3 minutes you said it's a recording.
That is a recording.
Yeah, of course.
Now, KROC was initially a station which generated all of its own programming for the hours that it was on the air. There was no network. In fact, even in those days, there was no there was records, but otherwise, was there any transcription at all?
Yes, we had two transcribed libraries, the World Library and the Thesaurus, which was put out by NBC. I think we had something like 6,000 selections in the two libraries combined.
Wow.
In addition to the transcriptions themselves, the service included script for various programs. So each month you'd get a large shipment of programs for the various programs that you put on. The scripts were pretty well written. Of course, in those days, every program, regardless of what kind of a program it was, had a theme, musical theme. So the script would come on, 10 minutes of theme and fade for opening and bring up first number and so on. So in that respect, it helped a lot. You didn't have to do too much ad-libbing. But the object was in those days to put on live programs if you possibly could. It didn't have to be good, just so they were live.
just so they kept the needles moving, so to speak.
Right. But it was a good service. being a small community, people like to tune in and see the local talent and listen to them, find out what was going on. And that's the reason for the large studios. Now, I think studios meant something different in those days than they do now. When I was down KROC for their 60th anniversary, one of the announcers looked at a picture of a studio and he said, "How did you ever get by with a studio like that? All there is a piano and microphones and chairs in it." Well, that's all you wanted in a studio in those days.
Right.
You didn't put technical equipment in the studio, and you didn't put microphones in a control room.
Right. Right.
So he couldn't quite understand how you get by with only a piano and a microphone.
Yeah. Where's the control board? Where are the microphones? You know, right.
Right.
So, but I mean, and there were a lot of musical groups that would come in,
Musical groups,
singers and so forth.
singers, choral groups, small orchestras, dramatic groups, children's programs, you name it. In those days, you had to be something for everybody. There was only one station, so you had to have something for the farm folks, the dance orchestra enthusiasts, the whatever. So you went from everything from kids' programs during the day to opera, probably.
First couple of years, what were the operation hours?
Seems to me 6 a.m. till either 10 or 11 p.m.
Now then, we moved from that live era at KROC to the introduction of the network in, I believe, 1940. Or was it? No, it was 39.
Seems to me it's 39.
39 that the network came on in the old location, and then KROC moved downtown to the First Avenue building.
Well, they were downtown in the beginning, too.
Oh, they were. It was called the Green Room initially.
Yeah.
I think it was.
Just a block away from the...
Right, the Martin Hotel, is
Martin
that,
Hotel.
remembering
Yeah.
that correctly? Okay. And then moved into more spacious studios. And you brought by today, and we'll show some of these pictures on screen here, but we can look at this wonderful book. And this was from when...
This book was, you commemorate the opening of the 101st Avenue Studios.
that building is still there, by the way, the 101st
Yes,
Avenue
First Avenue
building.
building is still
Right
there.
here. I don't think Fannie Farmer's there anymore, but
No, I'm sure it isn't.
the building is still there.
See the KROC on top. It was often called the KROC building.
As well it should be. In fact, our studios now are only about 2 blocks from there.
Yeah, yeah.
That's Gregory P. Gentling's office there, I assume. I think I have a picture of him sitting behind that desk somewhere in the archives, and having the carpet apparently has KROC on the floor there. That must
That's supposed to be an ear.
an ear.
KROC in it.
Well, it's like somebody spilled something. Well, anyway.
It was quite pretty in this lobby, the powder blue rug, and of course the natural wood here, and the burnt orange color on the chairs. It was quite
Wow.
attractive.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. It was. Now the studios themselves were really attractive as well. This must have been brand new. There, just as they were moving in, there's no clutter. There's no sign of humanity in any of these pictures here.
No.
We were commenting earlier the control room picture that I believe we still have that, or a very similar control board to that one, the RCA control board. Did you at that time, to put the station on the air, literally buy everything in one lot from RCA? The transmitter, the control boards,
Oh, no.
various
No.
amplifiers and things?
Transmitter was the only thing that was purchased as a piece of equipment.
Really?
Everything else was built.
Everything else? Really?
Now, let me show you a picture here of the transmitter building, or the transmitter interior.
Right, okay, so now
See,
here's the transmitter interior.
this so-called console was built.
Oh, it looks just like an office desk
Well, the console.
with the console,
Yeah, it is.
which is the rack.
And These lids here expose the 78 RPM turntables.
Oh, underneath the
Lift these
covers.
up.
There's
Yeah.
the covers on top of the desk, and then there's turntables underneath there,
Those are the 78s. The 33s were back here.
behind.
They were massive turntables designed originally as movie sound system turntables. Big fractional horsepower motor coupled sitting on a concrete pedestal with a shaft going to the turntable. Massive.
Did they have like a clutch, or did you use a slip cue? We used to call it a slip cue.
Well,
The turntable wouldn't start quickly.
These turntables took 5 seconds to get up to speed after you turned the switch on.
Oh, I have to wind that thing back quite a ways.
Yeah, 2 revolutions in 5 seconds. So you had to judge when you were 5 seconds towards the end of your commercial before you turned on the switch. And,
Like starting a latter day videotape, almost
Right.
same kind of thing. Now we've got the KROC building there with the first mobile unit in front of it with huge speakers on it. That must have been quite a vehicle.
huge speakers. This antenna was a VHF link that we used. We built that too.
And the antenna. Well, you had to be quite a craftsman to keep up with all this. That's really something. Now the tower we see behind the building, that tower was recently, in the last few years, those foundations. You said you still saw one of those foundations right at the corner of Highway 52 and Highway 14, where Highway 14 goes to Owatonna now in Rochester. It was a freestanding tower. The current KROC tower is just a few hundred yards from there. But
Yeah, right.
one of those pedestals or one of those foundations was still there.
Yeah, I think they're probably all there, but they're covered over pretty much.
Yeah.
I found one of them here a few years ago. I was poking around there, and I found one of the pedestals, and there was a broken piece of the base insulator that I took off for a souvenir, which I still have.
Wow. And one thing about KROC is the activities took them all the way over to Owatonna, and there was an Owatonna studio and lobby as well in those days.
Yeah, that was in '38 we put in the Owatonna studio.
Oh, really? And those were still the live days then, so that would have been to supplement the live performances in Rochester.
Right.
What kind of a link did you use between the two studios?
Telephone.
Okay.
The when we went NBC, the NBC feed came down to the Owatonna studios, and from there we split it one way to go to KROC, and the other way to go to Mankato, KYSM.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. What's on our next page here, as long as we're looking through the book? I think
Okay.
we're to the pictures.
The master control at Owatonna.
Right, there's the Owatonna. And you commented also that this was all equipment which you built.
Right.
You purchased the switches, rheostats, and so forth and so on, and put everything together.
Yeah, even made the amplifier to go in here.
Amazing. Here is now the lineup of the people at KROC. Up at the top there, Gregory P. Gentling, who was the grandfather of our current owner. Now, we'll get through the people here, people that I still remember. Of course, Fred, you're there. And you had Robert W. Cross. Bob Cross remained as engineer at KROC well into the 70s. In fact, I think till about 1981 or 82, Bob was still around. And G. David Gentling, listed here in the commercial department, is our current owner's father. And he was active in the business well into the 80s. We would see him around there occasionally. Amazing. Boy, I'll tell you, that was that commercial manager was one guy I wouldn't want to cross. Anson Thomas.
Yeah.
What was he like?
Not as stern as he looks there. Actually, a quite nice guy.
And I think I have in the special events department down there at the bottom, Walt Bruzek. Yeah, I have a picture of him standing in front of the second KROC transmitter, the Big Collins.
Oh.
Yeah, looking with quite a smile. He's quite a smile, that guy.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Boy, that is quite a book.
Yeah, it takes me back.
It does. Now, This was when KROC then became part of the NBC network and started playing all the famous radio programs that the names of which I'm sure we could reel off. That was a real change then for KROC now that it wasn't responsible for so many hours of original programming. How did that affect the going on there?
Well, it meant that the transmitter operators didn't have to work very hard. See, all of the transcriptions were played to the transmitter then. There weren't any facilities at the studio for playing records of any kind.
So only the live things would come down a phone line to the transmitter, and then there must have been some communication to cue things and so forth and so on, so everyone knew what was going on. Right. I see.
Got to be kind of hairy. For instance, in a dramatic presentation, the sound effects were all on records, and we were 2 miles away trying to synchronize the sound effects with what was going on at the studio. Got kind of hairy, but it worked.
Oh man, yeah. Wow, you just start even to think about a setup like that. That's very interesting. Now you were at KROC then as chief engineer until when?
1948.
Okay.
At that time, Maxine Jacobs, you see in here,
Beautiful
and myself and another partner, decided we wanted our own radio station.
Okay.
So we hunted around for a market and settled on Red Wing.
Okay.
So I found us a frequency that would work there and made an application, and we got a CP.
And that's K-Wing today.
K-Wing, it was KAAA.
KAAA in those days.
Right.
Okay. All right. And so that was the thing that you began to do more and more then after that was to engineer stations to get them on the air. Was that the second station that you put on?
Well...
Or were you doing other so-called consulting work before then?
I told you we'd get back to Les Carr in Chapter 5. Les Carr, as I said, was an extremely talented engineer. During the war, he worked for the Navy Department in a very high-ranking job. Right after the war, he established a engineering firm, consulting engineering firm in Washington, Weldon and Carr. I kept in contact with him, and he assigned me a lot of work out here. For instance, if he had a field intensity job or an antenna impedance measurement job, instead of sending somebody out from Washington, he'd have me do it. So I was sort of his representative for this area. And one day he called and said, "We've got a client in Germany, the American Forces Network, and we've been commissioned to design and install a new 150 kilowatt AM transmitter."
150,000 watts.
AM, yeah, 3-tower directional. He said all of the design work is done, and we're in fact starting to build the building and put up the towers. He said, I know you've had an interest in Europe. He said, also part of our commission is to hire a director of engineering for the network. He says, if you think you'd be interested in that, he said, why don't you go over and help on the tune-up of the directional array and get the station commissioned, have a look at it. If you think you'd like the job, we'll recommend you, and you can stay there. Which I did, and liked what I saw and stayed. AFN, as it's called, is about a 28-station network. 3 of the transmitters were in the higher power area. As I mentioned, Frankfurt 150 kilowatts, Munich was 100, and Stuttgart was 100.
What frequencies were these?
Frankfurt was 872.
Okay, that would go a ways. Holy cow.
Yeah, with 150 kilowatts plus the gain of the antenna in the major lobe, you really put out a signal.
I would guess.
Yeah. Then the other transmitters were 5s and 1s and so on. The programming was very much like an American network would be. We had all of the NBC, CBS, and ABC radio programs shipped to us on transcriptions with the commercials deleted. So from the Frankfurt headquarters, they were sent to all the stations. And just like in America, the major stations had their own studio and a cluster of smaller stations around them. So they would break off at times for the local news and local programming, very much like an American network. We had some FM, 3 or 4 FMs, and later I designed a FM-only network for France, about a 26-station low-power FM network.
That would have been for the French government or for the American forces?
Yeah.
Okay.
France,
And that's on the FM band that we're familiar with now?
right.
I see. And then what year was that then?
I went there in 51, about 7 years, 51 on.
Well, that's very interesting. Back to, just backtracking a bit, how long were you in Red Wing then? Not for very long then?
3 years.
3 years.
48 to 51.
And then your experiences in Europe, many and varied, and then eventually, though, back to the States. How did that happen?
Yeah, back to the States, and in the interim, Les Carr had been working on government projects. He'd built a antenna modeling farm out Leesburg, which is 30 miles out of Washington, and did a lot of government work. And the tail began to wag the dog, so to speak, so he formed a new company called DECO to handle the military applications. And the broadcast consulting firm was the tail. When I left Germany, then I came, of course, to see Les, and he wanted me to go to work for him at this DECO, which I did. We had a lot of very interesting experiences there. When I got there, they were just completing the first communication network to involve a heavenly body. It was a moon bounce circuit from Washington, D.C. to Hawaii. So whenever the moon was in the right place, it worked.
Really? What kind of a signal you're sending then?
It was a 400 megacycle signal, voice. But that was an interesting project. I didn't have much to do with it, but it was quite interesting.
Well, that would be the predecessor to the many hundreds, it seems, of satellites that we use these days.
Right. The next thing we worked on, we had a commission from the Navy to design and build a station that would transmit a signal from this country to a submarine halfway around the world, submerged in 30 feet of seawater. So the first step then was to do the propagation studies to determine what kind of a signal it was going to take to do that.
And did you arrive at the low frequency solution that's even used today?
Very low, 10 to 15 kc, which is down in the audio band.
Right.
I use kc because I'm a little timer. Kilohertz.
Whatever. Been doing it since before Hertz was, never mind. No, you haven't.
Yeah. I was around before Hertz.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was an interesting project. We modeled the antenna design on a large modeling platform we had there at a 100-to-1 ratio. Now, 100 times that frequency in the audio band gets you up into the broadcast band. So we were able to use conventional broadcast field intensity meters for our checking work. So it took a year or so to fully model and prove that antenna. Everything had to be scaled down to 1/100th, the size of the wire, the size of the towers, and everything, and the size of the insulators. We finally got that designed and built up to Cutler, Maine. The antenna system itself and the ground system covered 2 square miles. And we needed somebody to put in the ground system and do all the CAD welding. There were hundreds of miles of cable, hundreds of CAD welds. So we put that out for bidding, and the successful bidder was Thompson Lightning Protection Company.
Imagine that. Well, we're coming full circle now, aren't we?
Beginning to make sense.
Yes, it is.
So that was how I got acquainted with Thompson Lightning Protection Company. Anyhow, another project, speaking of the DECO, was one of my own that I had developed in the beginning without anybody else knowing about it. At the time, all of the communication between Europe and this country was by UHF radio. There was no satellites. So if the UHF propagation went out, the only thing you had was the commercial telephone cables. Whenever there was a aurora borealis, it blanked out everything. HF, you couldn't get a thing through.
Right.
So I set about to see if I couldn't figure out some way to get around that, at least to an extent. So I went to the Library of Congress and did a lot of studying on the aurora. And one thing I found while I was there that was really the key to what I was thinking about was a series of studies that Canada did on the aurora. They sent up rockets through the center of the aurora and measured the electron density per altitude, which gave them a good profile of electron density. Incidentally, the aurora is in the shape of a donut centered around the magnetic North Pole. That gave me a lot of information to work on, and from that sounding data, I computed that if we could get through the aurora at a given altitude, what we could do is take a bounce in the center of the donut at the F layer, bounce again back through the aurora at that same angle, and hopefully hit the United States. Well, the computation showed that would work, but you'd have to use an extremely high antenna to get the elevation angle of the main lobe of your transmitter down to about 1 degree. So that much work done, I took the idea to my boss, Les Carr, and he liked the idea, and he took it to the Navy.
Microphone.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I'm not used to the microphones. He took the idea to the Navy, who in turn bought it and gave us some money to try the idea out.
And?
So we set up a transmitter. We found a tower in Bodø, Norway, that we could use to put an antenna on. And we set up that as the transmitter site. And as it turned out, the only place in the continental United States that my computation showed that it would be usable, or at least the most reliable area, was a narrow strip of land along the Canadian border where Minnesota and North Dakota come together. Right in the center of that little strip of land was my old stamping ground, Pembina, North Dakota, where I'd had my first job with Northwest. So I said, that's our ideal receiving site. At that time, Northwest no longer used the facility there. They'd gone on straight to Winnipeg. So I went to Pembina and made a deal with the city to set up a receiving site there, which they granted us. And we set up the system, and it worked great. And as luck would have it, the aurora kicked up during our tests. And we were the only signal getting through from Europe. The military used us as a backup for some high classified transmissions at that time. And, so we proved the thing would work.
Amazing.
Plans were then made to set up a regular system, transmitter circuit. We wanted to find out how far beyond the actual Pembina area that would work. We set up receivers in Boulder, Colorado, Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix didn't get much. Boulder was on the edge, but we found it could go a little further than the original computations suggested.
Wow.
But at that time, all the projections showed that we're going to soon have satellites that we could depend on.
Yeah.
So it never really developed into an ongoing communication system, but it was usable for quite a while on a test basis.
Now, something that amazes me personally at this point, after all these discussions about really cutting-edge technology, is I've just completed my education, and I'm finding out now for the first time that you essentially are self-taught and self-tutored by your fellows in the business. You're not a college graduate.
Not a graduate. When I came back from Pembina to Northwest for the 4 years I was there, 3 years actually, I went to University of Night School. And beyond that, just a lot of studying myself.
And I'm sure more than a couple of worn-out slide rules along the way.
And working with some good engineers didn't hurt any either.
No.
You're probably familiar with Hector Skifter.
Tell me about Hector.
Hector was a consulting engineer attached to KSTP. KSTP at that time had their studios and offices on the top of the St. Paul Hotel. And Skifter had his headquarters in a penthouse adjoining in the area there. He'd come up from Northfield, where he was a professor at St. Olaf, and had built the St. Olaf station as a student there. Goes back to 1918, they were on the air. Skifter was a true genius, as later activities will show. And I worked with him a lot, and of course a lot rubbed off from Skifter.
Well, it can't hurt.
Yeah, right. So between a lot of studying and working with good engineers, and a lot of thinking about it. So.
Now, we mentioned Thompson lightning protection, and I really should have put this in the introduction, but that's how we met, because I had a problem with one of my transmitters that was continually being struck by lightning, and your company was recommended by the tower manufacturer, and I call up your company, and I mention where I work, and you say, well, we must have met at the anniversary. I'm the very first engineer, and Fred is still the broadcast specialist for lightning protection at Thompson Lightning Control. And still at the office, not quite 40 hours a week, I hope.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, theoretically. Sometimes I sneak out a little early, but
well, like
largely
today.
they're 40 hours. Yeah.
Like today, for instance. What if you had a highlight in your broadcast days in in America especially, is there one particular thing which stands out which you?
Well, they were all extremely interesting. I've been associated with a lot of very interesting projects. The one I look back most fondly on, and the only one I'd want to relive if I could, was the days at KROC.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose my age at that time had something to do with it, but I look very fondly on those days. And the more I can read about it in books like this.
Well, we've got a lot of things we turned over to the Olmsted County Historical Society. In fact, they're keeping a lot of our older stuff. But I'd love to have you down to the station again sometime, because I think there's probably some things that
I'm sure there is.
I'd get out of there.
Love to see it.
And we're going to be turning over that original transmitter and control board over to the museum here, to the PAVIC, and to Steve Raymer's stewardship here. As soon as he gets a truck to come and get it.
Well, Steve, I'll come up and polish it up when you get it.
All right. Fred, it is a pleasure to be in your presence again.
Well, it's a real pleasure to talk to you, Steve. Bill.
And
I don't have anything else I can add, but if you have
Well,
any
I
more
have
questions,
well, I have a feeling that we could go on all day, and perhaps we'll do this again. This really was very interesting. And thank you very much for being a good audience.
thank you.